Women Up Radio, designed to facilitate women's empowerment, improve your career, develop your talents, incorporate your passions, achieve fulfilment and success.
Hello, this is Women Up Radio, supporting Empower Women. And today we're talking about fulfilment and flourishing, how inspiration and enlightenment can bring success. I'm joined in the studio by my guest, Alice Beveridge, psychologist, former primary teacher, who is director of the cutting-edge motivation and personal development organisation, Tree of Knowledge. I love that name. So, welcome to the programme, Alice.
Hi, thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure. So, can I start by asking you to tell me about your work? Because I know you're a strong advocate of applied positive psychology, and particularly on finding satisfaction and the meaning in life, and focusing on the positive moments rather than the negative. So what led you to this, and how does this fit in with your organisation, Tree of Knowledge?
Okay, well, I as you say, I am a psychologist, and while studying my sort of original undergraduate degree, I was constantly getting pulled towards the world of clinical psychology. Now, as I'm sure you know, clinical psychology takes up probably about 80% of psychological research, and is obviously a very important and valid area of psychology to study. Yeah. But I quite quickly discovered I was only working with about 23% of the population.
Oh, really?
And I just found myself often wondering, well, what about everyone else? You know, it's not everybody that wakes up every day happy and motivated. And just because you don't fall into a clinical box doesn't necessarily mean that you are fulfilled in your life and have found meaning. So at this point, I made an interesting career decision. I decided to become a primary school teacher.
Yes.
I'm not a primary school teacher anymore. I chose to leave teaching for, I think, all the right reasons. Originally, I went into teaching with the intention of becoming an educational psychologist. And while I was teaching, I became aware of a movement in psychology that very much distinguished between different kinds of mindsets.
Yes.
Which was led by the child psychologist Carol Dweck. And this got me thinking about a training event that I'd attended when I was a newly qualified teacher, that was run by this company, Tree of Knowledge. And I thought to myself, do you know what, I'm going to get back in touch with them, because it was one of the first training events I'd ever attended that was all about me rather than necessarily the children or the curriculum. It was about how I thought and felt about myself and my role, whether I felt fulfilled. And, you know, there were aspects of teaching that were absolutely fulfilling, but there were also aspects of it that were, you know, I was just at the stage of getting a wee bit worn out and a wee bit run down by it all.
Yes. Yeah.
So they after a few conversations, were daft enough to give me a job. And it actually allowed me to get back to my kind of original passion, which is psychology.
Yeah.
But the backbone of everything we do at Tree of Knowledge is all about positive psychology. It's all about good, positive mental health and well-being. Yeah. And they were also kind enough, after a few years in the door, to fund my study of my applied psychology master. So it's applied positive psychology that my master's is in. And what I love about this is very much the research area about the other 77%. So it's for those of us who don't fall into a clinical group, but may still be dissatisfied with an aspect of our life. So it was kind of eye-opening for me, actually. It forced me to examine the difference between hedonic sort of pleasure-seeking happiness and the more eudaimonic meaning-seeking happiness. Yeah. And it was from here that my interest in kind of increasing people's satisfaction with all aspects of their life and this real pursuit of meaning was ignited. Okay. So through the work that we do at Tree of Knowledge, I've been able to develop a range of positive psychology-focused workshops and courses and programs that are designed to do just that, to help people in organisations understand their purpose and their motives and answer questions about why their organisations do what they do.
Okay. I'm sure everyone who knows about psychology will understand a lot of what you're talking about, but for us that don't know as much, can you tell me more about applied positive psychology and also about flourishing? Because I know flourishing and fulfillment are really important, and I believe that that's really the key to everything. But I know when you were speaking to me earlier, you told me about Flourishing, which has 5 key strands, which I think are very...
Absolutely.
So can you tell me more about that, what they are and how we need to use them for best effect?
Of course. Yeah, well, positive psychology, it developed as a discipline out of research into depression. And then it was this idea that if we can become depressed and we can use different interventions to bring us back to a kind of baseline norm, there must be a way of being able to increase optimism in lives as well. Yeah. So it sort of began with the work of Martin Seligman and Mika Csikszentmihalyi about 15 years ago. And since then it's branched off into lots of different areas. There's an area that looks purely at the idea of mindfulness and meditation. There's bits that look purely at health. There's bits that look at subjective well-being, which is how we report our well-being to be in the minute. Yeah. Sort of like if you ask me right now how I feel, how I would report that back to you.
Yeah.
But the area that for me is most interesting, as you say, is this area of flourishing. And this has really been led by Martin Seligman. He is a professor over at the University of Pennsylvania, and he spent an awful lot of time looking at happiness, and over the last 15 years has developed a really sort of well-rounded theory of happiness. And he refers to it as his PERMA theory, which is essentially the 5 strands that are required for individuals to flourish. Now, by flourish, he means being completely engaged in what it is that they're doing and experiencing real happiness, but not the hedonic side, very much the meaning side focus. So the 5 strands of that are positive emotions, the level of engagement that we experience, the types of relationships that we have and develop, the amount of meaning that we derive from what we do every day, and also how we see and celebrate our accomplishments. And Seligman suggests that each of these 5 core elements together can actually enhance our fulfillment in life.
Yes, it sounds really interesting. So when did he first do all that research? When did it come out?
I think the PERMA theory has been around maybe for about the last 7 years. Prior to that, he looked very much at the idea of authentic happiness, what it means to be truly authentically happy. And it was out of that he started recognising that these different strands have such an impact. So, for example, probably one of the most obvious ones is this idea of positive emotions. I mean, it's quite simplistic in some ways to think the more positive emotions I experience, the happier I'm going to be. But it actually works both ways. Yeah. It's almost the happier I choose to be, the more positive emotions I'm going to experience.
Yeah, yeah.
And the thing about positive emotions is they cover more than just happiness. It's about joy, it's about contentment, it's about focus, it's about relaxation. And there has to be a difference, I suppose, at this point made between pleasure, happiness, which is actually very closely linked to survival. Yes. For example, we need to satisfy our needs for things like thirst and hunger and sleep.
Yes.
Whereas the flourishing side of positive emotions are more to do with our drive for enjoyment. So taking part in activities that bring us joy and satisfaction.
Yeah.
So I suppose it's about being able in our lives to understand that there is a difference between the stuff that we have to do just in order to survive, but there's also changes or ways that we can look at things that change how we'll feel about it in the moment.
Okay. Because, I mean, as I've already told you, I'm very, very strongly supportive of fulfillment, and that fulfillment is really the only valid way of measuring success. Material success to me is not the key to having a good life. And I know you're passionate about that as well. So
absolutely.
How can we achieve it? And why is it so important?
Well, I think if we think about things like flourishing and fulfillment, they're essentially outcomes of getting the other stuff right. So from increasing our experiences in each of the 5 sort of core elements of PERMA, we can become more fulfilled. Yeah. So positive psychologists have spent sort of the last 15, 20 years researching and testing and validating a wide range of different positive psychology interventions, which are specifically designed to enhance each of these areas. Yeah. So if we're looking to achieve fulfillment, there are actually some quite straightforward and simple things that have been sort of scientifically tested and have been shown to improve how we feel about things, such as things as simple as keeping a regular gratitude journal. Yeah. Just taking the time every few days to write down the things that we're grateful for, whether it's the little things, whether it's the big things, whether it's actually maybe something devastating has happened in the world, but it's made you reflect on how lucky you are.
Yes.
It's those moments that in which we experience gratitude.
Yeah.
And the more gratitude that we experience, the more it boosts our level of positive emotion, so leaves us feeling better, essentially. But there's all sorts of different positive psychology interventions, and depending which area of your life you're trying to increase your satisfaction or your fulfillment with, then there's things from strength interventions that are designed to help people discover and acknowledge their physical and mental and social abilities, or probably some of the most well recognised or most used are things like Martin Seligman's character strength inventory. Mm-hmm. But then you can look at it from a completely different point of view, and there's lots of different sort of creativity-based interventions, because creative activities have been shown time and time again to boost our level of engagement, or essentially our experience of what positive psychologists refer to as being in flow or being in the zone, which is essentially when you're just blissfully immersed in a task. Yeah. And, some people find it from running or from playing musical instruments, but the creativity interventions such as free writing or drawing or sculpting have been shown time and time again to increase people's experience of flow. Yes. And I suppose actually one of the very on-trend interventions just now is mindfulness. Yeah. It's everywhere just now. You just have to look on social media or on the TV. Everybody's talking about mindfulness in almost every aspect, whether it's personal or professional. Yeah. And you just have to Google guided mindfulness meditations, and you'll find everything from meditations for relaxation to how to do a body scan to something called loving kindness meditation, and that's just a few of them. There's hundreds of them. But what I love about that is they are very nice to do, like it's an enjoyable experience, but the research has also shown that they have positive impacts on the cardiovascular system, on pain relief, on decreasing stress and anxiety, and so much more.
I know I'm a strong believer that you have to have full mind-body health as well as fulfillment, because everything...
Absolutely.
And if you're healthy, if you eat well, if you exercise, your body works better, so your mind works better, so your spirit is better. Yeah. I think the whole thing's linked, and I think people just don't pay enough attention to what you put in your body and what you do with your body. Yeah. Linked to everything.
Absolutely. They've even developed different questionnaires to help people find positive psychology interventions that suit them best. Oh, so if you have somebody who's naturally inclined to be more physically active, there are sort of physical activity boosting interventions that help particular personality types, whereas if people are more creative, they can point you in the direction of that. Or if you're at a stage in your life where you're needing courage, there are interventions to help you be more courageous or be more forgiving. So actually taking the time to find out, well, where am I in my life just right now, and what do I actually need help or support with? Taking one of those sorts of best fit questionnaires can be a really nice place to start and just get you started on something that's within your comfort zone. Yeah. And once you're happy with that, then you can start branching out and take a few more risks and maybe try something that you've not done before that maybe seems a little bit more out there or out of your comfort zone.
Yeah, well, that sounds a really good idea, that I'll have to try. But coming back to fulfillment and flourishing, and particularly bringing that into our careers, because obviously we spend so much time at work. The main part of our life, or our waking life, we're at work. So how can companies facilitate our feelings of fulfillment and flourishing, and what can they do to encourage their employees to think more about it?
Well, I think the responsibility for this is sort of twofold. Some of it lies with the organisation and some of it lies with the individuals. Mm-hmm. I do think, though, that businesses and organisations have to take this stuff seriously because it has such a significant impact on their employees' health and well-being. For example, at Tree of Knowledge, we do a daily mindfulness session just after lunch. It's about 10 minutes out of our working day, so it's not out of our break time, it's out of our working day, where the whole team get together, find a space on one of the sofas, and we take part in a guided relaxation together.
Really? And
as well as being quite nice just after lunch, absolutely. So you essentially get to have a wee snooze after lunch. But it's brought us closer together as a team, like whenever we have new people start, they do that thing where they look at you and go, do I seriously get to have a wee lie down now? And I'm like, absolutely. Because if you look at the research, allowing people to take that time to relax, it brings them closer together as a team, but it also boosts productivity.
Yes.
So why not take that 10 minutes out of your working day to do that? The benefits are tenfold, And what we then do is this is followed by what we describe as our learning time. One of our core company values is learning.
Yeah.
And a few years ago, we realised that it was actually probably the one value that we hadn't made enough time for. So we decided that after mindfulness, everybody gets 45 minutes then to learn or read or research or watch something that they want to learn more about. Sometimes this is directly related to the job that they do, but it doesn't have to be.
Yes.
And it's really an opportunity for people to experience flow daily and develop their skills and abilities in a self-guided way. And on an individual level, just sort of finding a positive psychology intervention that you enjoy can help us improve our performance in our careers. Mm-hmm. So whether it is, as I said, sort of physical activity level, which is obviously good for our physical health, but also good for our mental health and increases our ability to focus. Or it might be something such as taking time each day to identify 3 good things that have happened, and taking time to reflect on things that have gone well and consider where we can apply those skills elsewhere, rather than just, how often if something bad happens, we just go over it in our minds and ruminate on what's gone wrong. Yeah. And that can almost hold us back, because all we're focusing on is what we haven't achieved. Yes. So at the end of our day, we have a wee team meeting. Yeah. At 4:23, we finish at 4:30. So 4:23, everybody gathers on the sofa and we go through the things that we've achieved that day.
Really?
And it's this idea of at the end of the day, we just get to reflect on how much we have achieved. Sometimes we go, actually, I didn't do anything, but the majority of the time we're surprised at how much we're managing to achieve each day.
I think it sounds brilliant. It sounds so positive and productive, because people get into like a hamster wheel. They just work, and they never actually take time to think about themselves or to have a break or something like that. So I think excellent. It sounds great.
Well, I think simply the nature of our business, we're a motivational and personal development company. Yeah. And it would be completely hypocritical of us to go out and work with other businesses and talk about this stuff if we didn't do it ourselves. And actually doing it ourselves and it being part of our daily practice makes it easier for us to promote this stuff to other businesses, because we do it every day and it works for us.
Yes. Yeah.
So what better proof is there than somebody that's actually tried it themselves?
Yeah. You're living what you believe, which is wonderful.
Yeah.
I know we talked about emotional intelligence as well before the interview, and I know that's an important factor to do with fulfillment and flourishing and things like that, and positive psychology. Can you tell me more about the differences between how men and women react with emotional intelligence, and how this can be an advantage at work or disadvantage, whichever you think?
Or disadvantage, yeah. It depends what stance you take on it. Emotional intelligence, as it's time and time again, it's shown to be more important in the business world than IQ.
Yeah.
And this is because when working in businesses, we are working with people. So it doesn't matter what it is that you do, at some point, for most of us, maybe not everyone, you have to have some engagement with people. And how we conduct ourselves in those situations actually have a huge impact on how relationships progress, and whether it's talking to new clients or talking to members of your team. The stronger that relationship is, the more sort of social connections you have, the better it is for everybody. Yeah. But the thing about EQ, or emotional intelligence, I think it's fair to say that we know that it's important in the workplace. Yeah. But it's taking longer than, I don't know about you, but longer than I am happy with for it actually to filter in effectively.
Yes.
And I think some of this comes down to the fact that there are clear biological divides between men and women. Like, we're not the same.
Yeah.
The way that our brains work has been shown time and time again to be different.
Mm-hmm.
And people ask me, every time I'm out working with different organisations, they're like, are women really more emotionally intelligent than men? And it's quite a difficult question to answer, because in some ways, yes, they are, and in some ways, no, they're not.
Yes.
And it's because you're not comparing like for like. You're essentially looking at two different bell curves of emotional intelligence and looking at where they overlap. So obviously you get men who are incredibly emotionally intelligent, and you get women who show very little emotional intelligence.
Yes.
But on the whole, women's emotional intelligence tends to be greater than men's emotional intelligence.
Yeah.
And when I talk about emotional intelligence, we're really looking at there's 4 aspects that we talk about. And there's lots of different types of models, but for the purpose of today, I'm going to go with the one that uses self-awareness as one aspect, managing our emotions as another, empathy as another, and social skills as the fourth.
Yes.
And when we look at those 4 different components, women tend to have the edge over men when it comes to these basic skills.
Yeah.
But it's not, as I say, it's not quite as simple as that. But if we look at, say, empathy, for example, women consistently display higher levels of empathy.
Yeah.
But men are generally better at managing distressing emotions. So if you put that into the workplace, women may be more empathetic and more understanding, whereas men may handle the big challenges slightly better just because their brains work differently. And that's because the part of our brain that deals with empathy, the insula, in a woman, if you put men and women in an fMRI machine and look at what their brain is actually doing when they experience empathy, this part of the brain for a woman, it just lights up. And it's almost as if you can see the woman observing a distressing situation and her brain mimics it. So she essentially feels how the other person is feeling. What's interesting is men's brains do it too, but it switches off much more quickly. Women's is longer lasting, so may have a deeper understanding of why a person's feeling the way that they do, whereas men's switch quite quickly into a problem-solving mode.
Okay.
Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing.
Yeah.
If what you're trying to do is, if the most important outcome is to solve the problem.
Yes.
But in the world of work, that can have a negative impact on relationship development. It can leave the individual feeling like their emotional response is being overlooked or isn't as important as finding a solution. Yeah. Which is why for women in the workplace, it can actually allow us to develop more nurturing relationships with our colleagues and employees. And when women are in a position of power or sitting on boards, for example, it's when you get a much more balanced view of the world, because women are likely to see or think about the impact of different decisions in a different way. They're going to consider the emotional impact as well as from the business perspective. Mm-hmm. And that's why the sort of gender balanced representation is so important. And you'll have seen some of the research yourself, I'm sure, that suggests that more balanced boards make better decisions and are less likely to take unnecessary risks.
Yeah, exactly. Then it's because all of the statistics show that when you've got women on a board, the risk factor is much more balanced, and they get better results. So, but
absolutely,
there's something you said there that made me think of another question.
Yeah, sure.
Talking about women and being empathetic or empathic, does that mean that if women really do feel the emotions, that when there's a problem or a crisis, they can actually feel what the person's suffering, so they can understand better? If somebody comes with a problem or with some kind of, I don't know, problem with somebody that they're working with, that a woman normally can understand the situation better because they really do feel the emotion, almost as though they've got the same emotion themselves.
Absolutely, yeah. It's some of this research is quite new and is still emerging, but it's based on things called mirror neurons. Yeah. And it's this idea that when we see something in a situation, our brain mirrors it. Now, what's quite interesting is that it also comes down to how we personally view a situation. It's what's known as mental models. So my mental model of a situation may be completely different to somebody sitting on the other side of the table from me who's viewed the exact same thing. And that is influenced by things like your values, your beliefs, your experiences. Yes. Now, where women have a very slight edge in this is they are more likely, the research suggests, to take the step back and actually consider why somebody might be responding in a particular way. Whereas because men's brains snap into that problem-solving mode, sometimes they've almost skipped the problem and have missed the problem because they're so busy looking for a solution, instead of taking the time to fully understand what's actually causing the distress in the first place.
Yeah, I know. I drive everybody crazy because I always say why, and I keep going back to why, and I won't go on to the next step until I know the why. And they're like, "Oh, for God's sake, let's do it." I'm like, no, I want to know why.
Well, the thing is, humans are driven by meaning, aren't they? You know, from the beginning of time, philosophers have been searching for meaning and why. And but even if you listen to some like modern day rappers, they're still going on about, well, why do we do this? What is our purpose? Like we're obsessed with it. And organisations and people who have a sort of strong sense of purpose tend to be happier and more engaged.
Yes.
And if you're taking the time to constantly come back to this idea of purpose, or why is this happening, or why did that happen, then you actually get more engaged people, better retention for your absences, people are more resilient and are better prepared to handle challenge and adversity more positively.
You are listening to Anna Letitia Cook at Women Up Radio.
Inspiration and enlightenment and awareness are also essential to flourishing. So with these, how can they change our life, and what impact can they have on our work and our career?
Well, I think that feeling inspired and enlightened just has such an instant impact on our levels of motivation. And people are more likely to feel motivated when they're working towards achieving something that they care about. So I think we've all heard stories of somebody who, say, for example, has a very financially rewarding job, yet is still personally unfulfilled or lacks that motivation. And I think that's because money, we need money. Of course we do. We live in a society that is driven by money. But once our financial needs are met, money itself isn't enough to bring fulfillment. And that's when, if you look to the work of the likes of Dan Pink, who looks at what it truly takes to motivate people, he identifies 3 key things. One is autonomy, how self-directed we are, how much sort of freedom we have to make our own choices. The next one is mastery, which is how much opportunity do we have to get better at stuff. And the third comes back to something that I've already spoken about, which is this idea of purpose. So in our personal and in our professional lives, working towards that real purpose can positively impact our behaviour. And a lot of this comes down to mindset, as I suggested earlier on. For example, depending on what our outlook on the world is, how we can be inspired by different people in different ways. Or that same event, for example, say somebody you know has been incredibly successful, you can either be inspired by it, or you can almost feel threatened by it. In fact, if you think back to high school, imagine you and your best friend are sitting at the same test and they get a better mark than you. You have a choice in how you react when you find that out. Outwardly, you might go, "Oh, well done, you must have worked really hard for that." And on the inside, you might be going, "I hate you, how dare you beat me?"
Exactly.
And it's it's that thing of we have a choice in the moment of how we respond. And if we are looking to be more inspired, a lot of it comes down to how we view a situation. And success is one of those things that, it's different for everybody. For some people, it's aiming towards, by the time I'm 50, I'm going to retire because I've made this much money. For other people, this real idea of flourishing and inspiration and just being more sort of socially aware of how well we're doing is much more about achieving smaller, more meaningful goals. So there's so many, I think there's just so many different things that impact it. But it definitely does it has an impact on how motivated we are. So it's obviously going to impact how we work and how our career goes.
And I know, well, obviously finding satisfaction and meaning, it helps us with what we do in business, but also it helps us a lot for health and mental health. So what would you say from all the work that you do, from what you see, what are the main health benefits of this?
I think it has all sorts of positive impacts on our health. Obviously, as I sort of touched on earlier on, it can increase our levels of subjective well-being, so how we actually feel in the moment. And just by being aware of that, it can reduce our levels of anxiety and stress. I think that's probably, in the workplace, that's probably one of the most important ones. So when you have groups or individuals of people who have found satisfaction or are working towards meaning, their stress levels reduce. It allows us to sleep better, which ultimately has an impact on our levels of productivity, how we feel, how we talk to each other. I mean, I've got 2 young children. I know that if they've been up all night, I'm maybe a little bit nippier than I am if I've had a great night's sleep. So the cumulative effect of sleep deprivation can have a huge impact on your meaning in life. In fact, on a total aside note, I read something last week about the parenting gap. And this is the gap between people's mental well-being of people who are parents and people who are not. And it's fascinating to read because they talk all about how much people with young children in particular have much lower levels of sort of subjective well-being, but their levels of meaning in life are through the roof. So a lot of this also comes down to how we measure it. If you ask somebody how happy they are, and their definition of happiness is all to do with hedonic pleasure, then you're going to get a very different answer to if you ask them how much satisfaction do you experience in your life. So just because somebody says that they're not happy doesn't mean that they don't have meaning.
Yes, but actually you talking about that is, I've got the perfect example. My son and his girlfriend recently had a baby. Well, in fact, he's going to be a year old next week. And both of them look like complete zombies because they...
Yep, I can relate to that.
But happiness, they are so happy because...
Oh, absolutely.
It's everything that happens is wonderful. It's fulfilled them totally. So it's lovely to even if they are completely...
Yeah, it's amazing how just a little cheeky smile. I'm actually pretty convinced by the idea that it's a good thing children are so cute, because they have to be, or you just abandon them because they drive you mad.
Exactly.
But that cheeky little grin or that wee giggle, it saves their life about 100 times a day. I think my son's 10 months old, and if you'd spoken to me about 3 months ago about my level of satisfaction in life, you would have just got a death stare, I think, because I hadn't slept for about 8 weeks solid. But while I was doing my masters, I started my masters the same week as I went off on maternity leave with my daughter.
Oh, really?
And one of the things that we had to do, I'm a nutter like that. I always like to have an awful lot going on. But one of the projects that we had to do was a sort of personal exploration project. And everybody was doing all sorts of things about, if they start running, or if they start doing this, or they start doing that, how's it going to impact them? What I did, because I don't know, I think it's a psychologist in me, I was like, right, I'm going to measure my levels of meaning and my levels of subjective well-being before I have my baby, 6 weeks after, and 6 months after. And the scores were absolutely hilarious, because to start with, my subjective well-being scores before I had were just like through the roof. I was so excited. Life was wonderful, absolutely wonderful. And my meaning scores were pretty decent. At the 6 week mark, my subjective well-being was like through the ground. I was so tired, so exhausted. I wasn't sort of on a level of experiencing postnatal depression, but I was definitely on that I'm exhausted and I don't know how I'm going to do this. But my levels of meaning had shot through the sky. And then as we got towards that 6 month mark, they'd almost come and met again in the middle.
Oh, really?
So it's very interesting how satisfaction and meaning can change separately to subjective well-being.
Yeah, definitely. So that's a great example. So when everything seems to be getting on top of us, and when negativity is definitely gaining the upper hand, how can we turn it around?
I think so much of this comes back to taking time to reflect on why we're feeling the way that we do, and taking time to look at the benefits or the positives in our lives. Negative emotions such as stress or anxiety or worry tend to be the results of dealing with challenges or perceived challenges that we believe outweigh our skill set. If you look at the work of Mika Csikszentmihalyi, a Hungarian psychologist who's these days based over in the States somewhere, he's got a theory of flow, which is essentially this theory of engagement that I touched on earlier on.
Yes.
And there's two main components to this theory. One is that in everything we do in our life, every single day, we'll experience some level of challenge. And the other is that we bring different levels of skill depending who we are to meet that challenge.
Yes.
So, for example, if you find yourself in a situation that is very challenging and you don't believe you have the skills to deal with that challenge, and by skills, I'm not just talking about the hard skills, the functional skills, I'm also talking about things like the passion or the motivation or the sort of softer skills that we need to deal with challenges, then that's when we're most likely to experience stress or anxiety or worry. And there's different types of stress. There's good stress, there's bad stress. I'm a big advocate of the idea that there's silly stress. Like there are silly little things that wind us up every day that impact how we think and how we feel that don't really matter. Like my husband gets annoyed if I unload the dishwasher wrong because he's got his own little set of crazy rules about how that should be done. Or this has worked out well in my life because he's quite pernickety about that sort of thing. So I'm not allowed to do the washing in my house because I hang up the socks facing the wrong way. great.
Very positive. I would like that.
Sometimes I do it on purpose just so that he remembers that I'm not allowed to do it. Yes. But the fascinating thing though about stress is that although there's obviously bad stress, we hear about it all the time. Yeah. Stress can be a positive thing. It can have a positive impact on us. I need a deadline in order to get stuff done.
Yes.
That's quite positive stress. Yeah. And with this sort of third component of silly stress, the worrying thing is the brain can't actually distinguish between the three. Essentially, when it sort of sees a threat, it releases cortisol into our bloodstream, which in small doses is quite useful. Yeah. It wakes us up in the morning. It can increase our level of focus. But if we have too much of it, it can have seriously bad consequences for our mental well-being as well as our physical well-being.
Yes.
So this is where we have to be very aware of what it is that we feel is getting on top of us. Because if it's lots and lots of little things, essentially what happens is we get lots of little hits of cortisol, which over time build up in our bloodstream. Which means if something really big does hit us or does sort of pop up out of the blue, we can have a much more negative response to that than we would otherwise. Yeah. So when it comes to turning it around, it really comes to looking at, well, how do we readdress the challenge or how do we readdress the skill level? Because if you're too skilled and not being challenged, that's when you become bored.
Yes.
Now, I used to be a primary school teacher. I learned very quickly that boredom is one of the most destructive forces in the world. Yes. If you allow a class of primary ones or year twos to get bored, your classroom is chaos. Yeah. Because at 4 or 5 years old, they go off and they find something else to do. Yeah. As adults, I think it's still destructive, but it's destructive in a slightly different way. Yeah. Because when adults get bored, they either go and find another challenge or they just accept it as part of their life. Yeah. And if we accept boredom as part of our life, that skill level deteriorates. And then we're in a weird situation where we're not really being challenged, but we also don't really feel like we have the skills to deal with the challenge. Yeah. And we're essentially becoming apathetic. Yes. And I don't know if you've ever worked with somebody that's apathetic, but it's horrible.
Yeah, it's awful.
They're like mood hoovers, aren't they? They suck the life out of and the joy and the excitement out of whatever's happening. Yeah. So to really overcome this, I think it's about it almost comes back to the emotional intelligence things that we were talking about earlier on. It comes back to being aware of why you're feeling the way that you feel and being able to recognise, well, am I stressed? If I am feeling stressed, why am I feeling stressed? Yeah. What are the things that are causing me to feel stressed and how do I address them? Yeah. Is it something I can do something about? If so, brilliant. Do something about it. It'll make you feel better. Yeah. If it's something you have no control over it, sometimes we just have to let stuff go. Sometimes we just have to say, do you know what? That does annoy me, but it is completely out with my control. And I just have to accept that that's always going to be the way. And I have a choice here to look at this from a more positive direction. Yeah. Yeah. And that's when we can start to readdress the balance between challenge and skill. And if we can start to do that, that's when we're more likely to experience the engagement. We're more likely to experience flow. Yes. So much of this, to really answer your question, so much of this, how we turn it around when things are getting on top of us, all really comes down to being emotionally intelligent enough to know why we're feeling how we are, and then putting into action things that can help us feel better.
Yeah. And so what can corporations do to help foster a positive attitude and also improve the environment in the workplace?
Well, I think this just comes down to shaping the environment for success or growth. The highest performing organisations across the world all consciously shape their environment. Now, that doesn't have to be the physical environment, but that can help. So looking at how people sit in the office or looking at sort of breakout spaces and that kind of thing, that can help. But much more than that, it's about shaping a culture. Yeah. It's about defining your purpose as a corporation. And that has to almost come above your profit